Hello, I'm Morgan Peckma, Editor-in-Chief of City and State, and this is Last Look. Today our guest is Peter Galie. He's a Professor Emeritus at Canisius College in Buffalo, and he's also the author of the New York State Constitution, a reference guide. And we are at the Effective NY City and State Conference on the Constitutional Convention and the constitutional amendments on the ballot this year. Professor Galie, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
So in the talk that you gave, you describe the New York State Constitution in kind of absurdist terms. Can you explain a little bit more? You were referencing Samuel Beckett.
Well, the point was that we have a Constitution that many New Yorkers are ignorant of. On the other hand, we have a Constitution that has such bizarre oddities and anachronisms and obsolete material in here that if they did know something about it, that would be an embarrassment. So if they knew it, if they didn't know it, that's a difficulty and an embarrassment. If they do know it and they find out what's involved in it, they're also embarrassed. So that's an absurd situation when you reach that point.
So as an expert in the New York State Constitution, what is its primary dysfunction?
Primary dysfunction is that it is accumulated. A lot of amendments and changes and material over the year without anyone ever sitting down and saying, you know, we have to clean this up. These are no longer working. This material is obsolete. This material is an anachronism. And you can't do that with amendments from the legislature. Somebody has to sit down at a convention and look at the thing as a whole and put it together.
One of the things that we heard from some of the speakers was that instead of amending the Constitution, we should be culling back the Constitution and starting afresh in areas. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. I think it's time to look at the document as a whole. Instead of adding things on without removing things, we need to look at how the parts relate to one another so that they are consistent. So we don't have material that's left in there and we've added new material to by amendments. It does make sense. And the only venue that can do that is a constitutional convention.
And so by law, the Constitutional Convention comes up on the ballot every 20 years that we vote on it. Next time it comes up in 2017. You talked about that there are some fears of the Constitutional Convention. What are the fears of that coming to place? And apparently you find them unwarranted.
I do. For example, the fear is that in this day and age, the rednecks or Tea Partyites will control this convention. They'll take away our social welfare. They'll take away the forever wild. They'll eliminate individual rights. They may add a death penalty. They may add a right to guns. But when the opponents say these things, I ask them, what state are they talking about? This is not Kansas or Mississippi. This is a state that has had a liberal, moderate, progressive tradition since its beginning. This is a state that has adopted some of the major provisions, and this is a state that voted for Obama at a greater percentage than the rest of the nation. There is no basis for that kind of radical reactionary actions on the part of any convention in New York's history. That's why I reject those.
So you think that's just a scare tactic perpetrated by people who don't want a constitutional convention?
I absolutely do. There are forces that worry about changes. Labor unions, for example, don't like it. They're worried about the pension provision being eliminated. Welfare groups think that the welfare provision is going to be taken away. But on what basis do they say that? Is there any groundswell in New York for any of these kinds of movements to retrench? I don't see any of that. Indeed, the Republican Party now no longer can control the Senate.
And any changes would have to be approved by the voters anyway,
It would have to be approved by the voters. And there's a double check here, you know. And I think those fears are ungrounded, either by virtue of our history or by the procedures that we're using.
What about the sense that the Constitutional Convention would be dominated by the same legislators who lead, you know, who have gotten us into this mess right now, that the representatives in the Constitution would be the same players? Is that a legitimate fear?
Well, it's interesting that they make that point, because on the one hand, these reactionaries are going to take over the convention, but on the same token, they're going to be the same old the legislature who aren't going to do this because they're part of the establishment. So the argument here is kind of inconsistent. Which one is it? In 1967, we had a convention, had a lot of the legislators in it and judges. That convention produced some of the strongest and most forward-looking reforms in New York State's history. Now, the voters rejected it because the decision was made to do an all or nothing for the vote. But most of those provisions have now become the law of New York State. So one can hardly say that the results of the convention are determined by the fact that there will be some legislators or judges there. The history of our state does not support that. The 1937 convention was a little New Deal in terms of the civil and social rights it put in there. They were dominated by legislators and judges as well. So it doesn't seem to matter that some of the people who get elected may be part of the establishment. Something happens in a convention. It's not a legislature.
Weren't all the amendments packaged together and kind of set up to fail? Is that why they were all put together onto one place on the ballot? What
they did in '67 was they submitted them as a new constitution. So you took it all or nothing. In 1937, what they did was they put all the non-controversial amendments in one omnibus measure on the ballot, and then the really controversial ones, and there were 8 of them or 9 of them, they put separately, so voters wouldn't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So we got all the valuable ones were adopted, and the 3 most controversial ones, it's interesting, were rejected by the voters, as if they understood the good from the questionable.
So you trust the voters?
If you give the voters the kind of information fairly presented in this kind of situation, I do trust the voters.
But do you think that that voters now, that wasn't an era where there would be large-scale advertising campaigns by special interests trying to skew people's perspectives? Have the times changed?
Well, the times haven't changed indeed, but I think it's important for us, in the face of the fact that there will be significant forces opposing this convention, and there will be significant forces opposing any results of conventions. What is the alternative except to make the case as effective as you can before the media? Hope that individuals rise to the occasion and make it clear that what we're doing really makes sense. It's possible that it will fail, but you know, I know very few things in life that are worthwhile that don't involve some risks. We lose our nerve. We lose our nerve about making changes and confronting the problems that we have. We're lost.
Professor Galie, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And that's it for this episode of Last Look. For more episodes, please join us on the web at cityandstateny.com.